trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is inspired by a process that we go through as coaches several times per year, and it is what did we recently learn and how are we going to apply those lessons so that in the future our athletes can be more ready for the ultras that they are preparing for. So I brought on the podcast today CTS coaching director Chantelle Robitaille, as well as one of our crack coaches, Ryne, to talk about what they learned throughout the course of this year that they are going to apply for next year. And it was an extremely interesting conversation about how we can avoid these crises of confidence that athletes inevitably experience as their races are rolling around, how we can instruct our athletes better on how they can instruct their crew and their pacers better in order to help them throughout a race. And in addition to that, how to properly structure training camps, which are becoming a more and more valuable, and I would say an obviously valuable part of the athlete training process. I don't need to tell you guys that ultramarathons are arduous, and we are all trying to squirrel away a little bit of time to train for them, and these training camps are just a great way to do that. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Chantelle Robitaille and Ryne, all about what we have learned this year. I always find these funny because when I look back on it, because we go through this as a coaching staff in some form or fashion, both formally and informally every year, there are things that you should have already known, but they get reemphasized for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And I think the lessons shouldn't be taken for granted. I always think that we should actually pay more attention to them and then come back to them before they actually unfold in the next year. Mm-hmm. So anybody listening to this podcast, which is going to come out in the September timeframe, should actually listen to this in March or April or May, because that's when these errors start to it's actually when these errors start to unfold. So if we've each got one learning lesson from the year that we're going to emphasize and apply to next year, and probably around that March, April, May type of time frame. But I want all the athletes that are listening to just recognize that the lens that we're looking at this through is our coaching lens, and our 30 to 40 athletes that we each, have contact with every single year, and coaching those athletes throughout the year. And in addition to that, supporting those athletes at races, there tends to be some common themes that come up that everybody can learn from. So Chantelle, you volunteered to go first. So why don't you kick it off?
All right. Showing confidence, because my trend is a crisis of confidence. And what I have found throughout the race season this year is, and maybe this is a holdover from COVID, where people had a lot of new anxiety in their lives about a lot of things, and a lot of things they couldn't control. And they just get to a point where everything is really going well with their training and going according to plan. But they start to have sudden, real anxiety about something really small, like sudden anxiety about missing a single run. And then they're just carrying that throughout the week, where they're maybe they miss a 1 hour run on Tuesday. And then I see I've prescribed a 3 hour run on Saturday, and they're out for 5 hours because they missed a 1 hour run earlier in the week.
So they're not only adding the hour back, they're adding in something on top of it to make up for it.
Not to mention the stress that they've been carrying, because all week I see in the Training Peaks comments, I'm still really upset that I had to miss that run on Tuesday. And if you look at the reason why they missed the run on Tuesday, and it's because their kid had a soccer practice. You went to your kid's soccer practice, and that's what you should focus on, right? What you were able to do, not what you weren't. And I feel like I'm seeing more of that this year throughout all of my athletes.
And do you think that's amplified the closer it gets to the race? Meaning if there's a race in August and that 1 hour gets missed in July or in early August, those comments that you just mentioned are amplified or either on versus being off. Mm-hmm. If that same thing happened in May or June.
Yeah, absolutely. especially in this season now where we have more races happening. They're watching other people training, they're watching other people racing. And I feel like there's that FOMO thing, or they're looking at someone's Strava and they're freaking out because they're like, well, I should have had X number of miles last week, even though I never prescribed mileage. I should have run X number of miles last week, but I didn't. And they're really spending a lot of time worrying about what they feel they should be doing, should have done, rather than what they did do, what they are doing, and what's ahead.
Well, that all comes down to people want what they don't have. If they don't have vertical, they want vertical. If they don't have heat, they want heat. If they don't have cold, they want cold. If they don't have a massage therapist that they trust, they want a massage therapist that they trust. And I've seen some of that get echoed throughout my coaching career, not just more recently. And the quintessential crisis of confidence that I have always kind of thrown up a big red flag with is starting to do something completely new from a workout perspective in the 4 weeks before a race. So a workout that you've never done, an intensity that you've never done. And that's almost always catalyzed by some elite athlete putting it on Strava or on Instagram. I saw Kilian Jornet do this really specific workout, so I'm going to start to incorporate it 2 weeks before the race. And we all know that the time course for any reasonable adaptation is not days, it's several weeks or even months. And so the proposition of that, the proposition where that workout will actually make an impact is actually kind of hilarious, because you just simply don't have enough time for the adaptations to sink in. It literally is a psychological thing of craving something that you saw somebody do or something that you don't have.
Mm-hmm. Or another one is maybe looking at an athlete, and again, it's probably an elite athlete, right? Looking at an athlete that's had success in a particular race over multiple years, and suddenly that athlete decides to go all become a data analyst and look at several years of an elite athlete's training and seeing like, oh, this is how they typically build. Why am I not doing that? Or why am I only running X number of hours a week? And again, they're looking outside rather than inside, looking at where they're at, what their capabilities are. And probably you don't have 35 hours a week to train. So why are you even worrying about that?
But the ads, and what I mean by that is an athlete misses something and either adds it back or adds 2 or 3x of that back. I've always the combative coaching strategy that I've always used for that, and that comes up not just close to the race, right? As you're mentioning, it's a crisis of confidence. Mm-hmm. That comes up kind of throughout the entirety of the training process, where just stuff happens and you have to make this decision of, does the missed time actually make a difference, and do you actually need to make it up? The combative coaching strategy that I deploy for that is just to look at the percentage of the whole. Mm-hmm. And if the percentage of the whole is material, then you should shuffle some things around and try to get that volume back, or do something different or whatever, because you have long time frames to work with. Mm-hmm. If the percentage of the whole is immaterial, then you just kind of play on, right? You just kind of, nothing goes to plan, nothing's perfect. If you get 90% of the way there from a training perspective, that's going to be good enough. That last 10% is probably 1% of the actual improvement. That's the ratio that we have to keep in mind. But keeping in mind that there's a bigger picture, as opposed to having this laser-like focus of day to day and week to week, I think is the best combative strategy. Zoom the lens out and look at the percentage of the whole. Mm-hmm.
And I think also just helping, I think with athletes getting sick as well, right? With COVID, they get COVID and they don't know, at the beginning, they're really panicked because they don't know, maybe there's a million things, like this is real anxiety, right? They've got someone who's immunocompromised in the house or within the family. They don't know how it's going to affect others around them. And then how is it going to affect them? How much time do they have to take off of training? How are they going to recover? And that's a real concern. And for some, even if they know, okay, I'm legitimately sick. I legitimately am not breathing well. I understand I can't go do a tempo workout, but I should be doing a tempo workout because it was on my long range plan, and trying to help them understand that training and racing is just like life. Stuff happens and we have to be adaptable, and try to help them understand that in a 100-mile race, you're going to have that perfect plan, which is only as good as the day it's written.
Yeah.
Because you can't control all of the things. And I think zooming out, look at the stuff that you have done, look at how much time we have. And here's what we can do to still, the focus now is getting you to your, back to running safely and healthily. And that's what has to matter for now.
Well, and once again, what helps with that is just what you mentioned, the long range plan, and specifically rack and stacking the order of priority of what's happening throughout that long range plan. It's one thing just to say, hey, the best laid plans and it's going to go awry or whatever. But if hey, this phase is more important than that phase, and that phase is more important than the first phase, then when you come up with those bumps in the road, getting COVID or travel or getting injured or sick or whatever happens, you don't plan for those things to happen, because we all plan for things to happen perfectly. You know what to push and what to shove and what to anchor. And I think that's extremely important that's an extremely important process to do when you're initially starting to map things out. So next year, when everybody starts going through their planning processes, they're going to have their series of events. And, all of our good coaches are going to start to lay out their annual training plans or their long range training plans. One of the key features of that probably isn't emphasized enough, if I'm really thinking about it, is simply the order of priority in terms of, we really want to make sure that this happens. If I can compromise a little bit here, that's okay. And this is, maybe this doesn't matter quite as much as the first two things. I think that context helps all of those changes actually occur, because we all want to do everything. And if you don't have enough time as you thought you were going to have at the beginning, for whatever reason, you're going to have to compromise somewhere.
Yeah. And I think that's what's hard. A lot of our athletes are not professional athletes. They are athletes who are professionals. They're juggling families and jobs and everything else. And so, sometimes something has to give for a little bit of time. So, there will be times where you are going to have to compromise, shift things around. And I think for me as a coach, thinking about when I do, the year in review with athletes and looking at how, what did our long range plan look like? How did the training go? What were successes for the athlete? What were challenges? And to use that information going forward. I think one thing I would like to do as a coach is to look for some of those non-confidence cues a little bit earlier and try to nip those in the bud. Maybe there are areas that maybe there are things I could explain better. Like you just mentioned, looking at the long range plan, this is our roadmap. We may take some shortcuts. We may take some detours, but these are the key points of interest along the route. Yeah.
Well, in addition to that, normalizing it. Because if it's a common theme, all three of us on this call right now, we all have athletes that have had a little bit of this crisis of confidence. If you can normalize that to the athlete and say, hey, listen, this is normal. Like when you get close to a race, it's, you're going to doubt some of, the training that you've done leading up to it. That's fine. A lot of people go through that. Here's why you should be confident, right? And just kind of like laying it out in that sequence. It's normal. You've done all the work. Let's go back and look at it. And here's, you can be honest. Yeah, you missed this. Does it matter all that much? Probably not. Maybe a little bit. And then when you get into the really honest situations, and I think that this is one of those times where if you are consistently realistic and honest with your assessment with athletes, this process actually becomes quite logical and less emotional, because you can go through, and if you have to course correct because of something that happened during the training process, if you have to course correct their goals, you now have a reasonable, logical framework to do it from. And because you've always been honest with them, they're going to take you at your word and go, you know what? Okay, instead of a 24-hour Leadville finish, I'm going to focus on a 28-hour Leadville finish. I've been through that with several athletes that have kind of gone through that process where, in a perfect year, if they had perfect training, they can have a big belt buckle type of finish. But you know what? That perfect year didn't unfold for whatever reason. So let's course correct a little bit. And I think the key to all of that is honesty throughout the entire process, and not just being overly optimistic all of the time, or dissociatively optimistic all the time, is what JT Kearney would always tell me.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. And I think it's a good thing for athletes to look at. You know, they are really emotionally connected to their running or to a particular race. But if their training suddenly starts to take up a lot of anxious feelings in their life, and it starts to become, you know, something veering towards negative, and it might even be impacting them negatively within their family life. One of my athletes was telling me this week on a call that he hasn't been sleeping well, and his older son at the breakfast table said, like, "Dad, why aren't you sleeping at night?"
The son did. Holy cow.
Yeah. And that really hit him,
Jesus,
you know,
wow.
and he's like, my gosh, like if he's noticing it, I really need to look at making some changes.
Yeah.
And so we talked about, you know, what are some changes that can be made? Do we need to change the training around a little bit? Do we need to, you know, are there other changes you can make within your schedule? Do you just need, you know, you've got 4 weeks left before your race. You know, your family is so supportive. And I know the family because I've met them in real life. Your family is so awesome. And you have your family meetings, you know, like I feel like they're willing to support you, but if you're not willing to take their support, what does that show to them? You know, if your wife is saying like, please go to bed early and I'll look after the kids stuff, getting them to bed, I'll look after it. Take the help, you know, ask for support. You might be surprised what the answer is.
Yeah.
And take it if it's offered to you.
I dig it. I think a lot of athletes can resonate with that. Having gone through a season, we're going to, you know, post this towards the end of most people's seasons. And if they rewind their psychological framework leading into the race 4 to 6 weeks out from it, they can probably, it'll probably resonate with them in terms of some areas of doubt starting to creep in, and whether those areas of doubt manifest in changing a workout or starting to look at the grass is greener on the other side or whatever it is. I think that's a point well taken. So needless to say, always look at your training, think about the percentage of the whole. And as you mentioned at the very tail end of this, Chantelle, take the help when you can get it, because these are hard things that we're asking ourselves to do.
For sure.
All right, Ryne, you're up. What did you learn this season?
A couple points to the crisis of confidence. It usually takes place during the taper. And here's my plug for keeping really good post-activity comments on your training. Like if you've been descripted and maybe a specific interval block in which you felt really good, and you've kept notes of like, I felt like crap going into the warm up, and then I knocked it out of the park. Like those descriptors, like you can really resonate with them when you're going through that crisis of confidence. Like, oh yeah, I do remember I felt really, really good. Don't just leave the like thumbs up or like it was good. Like be descriptive. So when you go back to read it, that memory is really triggered, and like that confidence is boosted. And then another thing is if the athlete's been in a rut, they've missed several runs, give them a good softball workout. Give them something that's like their bread and butter or one of their favorite workouts. It may not be very specific to their event, and you have to stay within reason with that concept, but give them something that you know will give them their confidence back. Or if they haven't went and ran with their best friend in a while, like, hey, go meet up with so-and-so and go run for 3 hours. And then they talk the whole time, they catch up. They weren't even thinking about the 3 hours when they ran, and they got out of their own head.
Ryne, that last point, that's one of the few times that I'll bend training architecture. If I know, like, I really, this workout is not the right workout for this race. But if for whatever reason, it's a bread and butter workout, as that's the vocabulary you are using, or it's just something more in their sweet spot or something that they're familiar with, getting the ball rolling back on confidence at the expense of like the perfect training architecture, that's usually a good compromise to start the process. Eventually you have to wean off of things, right? Because you can't use that as a crutch for the entirety, because then the expense of that is some sort of physiological development. And that's that's going to be that's going to eventually, or the rope on that's going to run out eventually. But I agree with you that using something, and this is like a parlor trick almost, using something to get that confidence rolling, and that's something being something they're familiar with or really good at, can be a good trick to just get the ball rolling, because there is momentum, right? We talk about this a lot in sports. There's momentum that's involved in confidence, and when you don't have it, it's a tough ship to turn around, and it's worth it to do some things actively to get that ball rolling. All right, Ryne, so what's on your list?
All right, mine has to do with crewing and pacing. And have a plan, stick to it, and don't be a hero. Because in the last couple of weeks to the race, you're talking about those crises of confidence. There's a lot going on, but you still need to plan with your athlete. Here's who's coming to help you: your wife, your husband, whoever. And your job as the coach, reach out and you need to plan with them. Don't leave it up like, oh yeah, we're all going to get together the night before and throw something together. That can work, but it also cannot work, because it's kind of hard for everybody to get on the same page when they've had their expectations coming in the day before, and then you're trying to gauge what they're thinking. You're like, actually, no, we're not going to do this. It can be hard for them to switch. So I think having the plan, it starts with like designating the crew chief, of like who is in charge. Start with that, because if the wife wants to take over, the best friend or whatever, not that they're going to argue and butt heads that day, but it's going to like who's leading, who's following. And it's all
usually
about
the strongest personality that ends up taking over that role, right? If nothing's designated, the person with the strongest personality will take it over.
And that's not the best personality to lead sometimes. So like knowing who your crew chief is and having the plan going in, like talking, you should know what your runner needs on race day, and then having that laid out with your crew of like, okay, I know they need tough love. I know somebody needs to be on the timer to get them out of the aid station because they take too long. Knowing all these things about your runner, so you're not a liability to your runner. And then I would say like, don't try to be a hero, because everybody's so excited on race day. The runner has put in weeks and months. They've mainly finally got into Western States, first 100 miler. You want to do everything you can to help them, and you're so excited. But go back to that plan you had. If you said you were only going to pace 10 miles, stick to that, because that goes back to you can be a liability because you've been up all day. You're pretty tired. Maybe you skipped a meal because you forgot. And then you go to pace a few extra sections than you thought, and you slow down. And what good are you then? Now you're holding your runner back. They're worried and stressed about you. It's like, oh, do I leave them? They're struggling. What's going on? What's happening? And then it's the silly cliche, put on your oxygen mask first. You got to take care of yourself throughout the day. The best reminder of this is I got to go out and crew and pace at Badwater, and we had a designated crew chief. He had been to the race many, many years, so he knew the gist. He had a strong personality, which was very good and worked out well. And he knew what to do. There was 3 of us that were on crew duties, and it's like, hey, you're going to work in 4-hour shifts. Whoever is in this seat of the van, you don't get out of the car. It is your job to rest, and having very defined jobs in that way. So it's like, well, if I'm going to help at 2 a.m. in the morning, take care of this runner, I do have to sleep now. And everybody's taking their turn. And after about 12 hours through the night, there was no pushback from the crew. It was like, oh yeah, it is pretty nice to rest through the night before your shift. I
think a lot of pacers, they forget or they fail to realize that the runner still has to run the whole way. It's not like they're picking them up and spiking them like a football at the finish line or anything like that. They still have to put one foot in front of the other and get to the finish line. And I've always kind of boiled down this, whenever people ask, hey, how do I pace? All right. I've kind of boiled it down to 2 strategies. When things are going well, you just get out of the way. Don't do anything. If they're eating, they're drinking, they're moving down the trail at the speed that they're expected to move down the trail, Don't do anything. Let them keep doing that. Like, you don't have to intervene because it's still them running. When things go south, then you intervene. You switch up the order. You're running first, you're running last, whatever that is. You get them to eat. You force them to get out of the chair and things like that. But as long as things are going good, your job is to not screw it up. So just get out of the way. Just get out of the way and give them company. Tell them a silly story, like, kind of stuff like that. Like, just realize that the runner still has to do. They're still doing all of the work. Don't overemphasize. Yeah, it's nice to have a pacer out there and things like that, but don't overemphasize the impact that you can have, particularly if things are going good. You make your money when things start to go south. When things start to go south, then you can start to, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to give them a caffeine pill. I'm going to get them out of the chair. I'm going to tell them to quit bitching about their feet. Like, whatever intervention you need to throw in at the time, you should throw it in when things go south, not if things are going well.
I had one runner coin this phrase perfectly earlier in the year. It's like, be the brain. As the pacer, be the brain when you need to. Like, okay, runner, you're following my feet. I'm reminding you when to eat. You just follow. Or if things are going well, then you be smart and stay out of the way, like you said. But KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Yeah. Be the brain, keep them on course, words of encouragement, tough love, whatever they need, crack the whip. But they, like, by the time you pick up your runner, it's 12, 14, 16 hours in. Obviously, they're physically tired, but mentally, they're very tired too. They need to be reminded to eat. They need you in front and know you're staying on course. If the runner's like,
unless you're at bad water. Unless you're at bad water.
You
don't want to get them thrown out.
No. Follow the rules. Goes back to knowing the plan and sticking to it. But like, if your runner asks, like, did we miss a flag? And you're like, I don't know. That's not good, because then they're going to freak out. But yeah, keep it simple for them so they can keep locomoting and get to the next aid station and to the finish line.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that, because a lot of pacers, they get into it out of like the goodness of their hearts and they want to spend like time out on the trail, but they have to realize that it's still a job, right? I mean, it's still like the runner is putting some level of responsibility on you to help at a certain point, and you've got to take there's some degree of seriousness that you have to take with that. And it goes into, you got to download the map on your iPhone. There's no reason anybody should not have that, right? That technology is it's readily accessible. And even on a really well-marked course, you never know kind of what's going to happen. Keeping track of how much the runner is eating. That's something that you can easily do. Just listen for the wrappers, watch them drink. And if they're doing it, great. If they're not, hey, when's the last time you drank? Okay, 10 minutes ago. Okay, let's drink again in 5 minutes. Like those kind of simple things. It should be easy for the pacer to do, because they don't have, in a 100-mile race, 50 miles of deterioration underneath their body. So it should be easier for them to have the mental faculty and the physical faculty to do that. But keeping it simple, I think, is the big thing. Run, eat, drink, and then stay on course. If you get those 4 things, I'm like, what else can you do? I mean, there's some like advanced stuff, that you might pull out when shit's really hitting the fan. But in most cases, you can get by with those 4 points pretty easily.
And if you're pacing, have realistic expectations. Oh, it just works out that you're supposed to have a 15-mile long run on your plan that weekend, and you're going to get it in pacing. It's probably not going to be as fast as you want it to be. So you can't get frustrated and bleed that negative energy into them, because you forgot you're going to be doing 18-minute miles with them, and you had to get this long run in. Like, you have a job. It's about your runner. Don't get disappointed and upset because they're going slower than you thought, or they need something else, or they have to drop or whatever. Like, you're there for your runner, serve them, disregard your own training for that weekend.
Chantelle, whose camp is it?
I was just going to say that. It's not your camp.
So the background on that, just for all the listeners, is whenever we run our camps, I give this, what now has become a quite prolific speech to all of our coaches that come to it. And then I relay it to our athletes just so that they know it as well. And that is, it's the athlete's camp. It's not the coach's camp. we don't give a crap about our own training that weekend. We care about all the training that the athletes get to do that particular weekend. They've flown in from all around the country. They want to come to Colorado Springs and, run mountains and things like that. And you are going to take advantage of that. It's the same thing during a race. It is the athlete's day. It's not the crew's day. It's not the pacer's day. It is the athlete's day. So if you've got training on, and I get super upset when I see things like this. Pacers go out and they put in 5 miles before they start pacing. They put in a workout before they start pacing or something like that. It's like, you know what? You can take one day. You can take one day and one run, not to be so freaking selfish, and put all of the energy into this person that has asked you to do this and you've agreed. Like, that's not that big of an ask. Don't be so friggin' pretentious about your own training for one stinking day. So yeah, if you are out there pacing, it's the athlete's day. It's not your day.
It's not your camp.
It's not your camp.
It's not your camp.
Our famous line there. Okay. Ryan, anything else you want to add?
No.
Okay. That is a great segue, because my learning lesson is about camps.
Camps.
So for the listeners out there, I'll serve up a link in the show notes to a podcast that Ryne was actually on where we talked about camps. And every single year, I am amazed at the workload increase that athletes can handle in a camp environment. It just absolutely blows my mind. And every time I look at it on paper, when I draw it out in Training Peaks, I inevitably come to one conclusion: this is too much. It's too much volume. It's too rapid of an increase. They're going to altitude. There's this other complicating factor, kind of whatever. And every single year they're able to handle it. And the side point, I'm going to talk about the side point first. The side point to that is that the duties is otherwise specified. The stress is otherwise specified that is not there during the camp. I'm the husband or wife, I'm the breadwinner, I'm the soccer coach, all those other things. Those things are quite material in the whole stress goulash that is going on in a normal situation. But the second thing I take from that is that the athletes can handle things that you normally would not throw at them if you can remove that stress. I was just at a camp with an athlete this week that is training for a Tour de Jante. And by the time this podcast comes out, we'll see if this camp actually had a material impact. But the athlete lives at sea level, has no access to anything above maybe a couple hundred feet to him. So does not have mountains at all. Mm-hmm. So we brought him out here into the Sawatch Range in the Leadville, Buena Vista area, and just did 14ers ad nauseum, 10 to 12 hours a day of going up and down 14ers. So from 10,000 feet to 14,000 feet, and then back down to 10,000 feet, and then back up to 14,000 feet, just on and on and on for 12 hours a day for 3 days straight. And he handled it magnificently. So not only was there an increase in volume, it's running an hour and a half or 2 hours a day. It's normal person. Not only is there a 4 to 5-fold increase in the normal volume, you have the altitude and you have the elevation gain and elevation loss. So you have all the musculoskeletal stress that comes along with descending that. And was he tired at the end of it? Yeah, sure. Did he have a hard time sleeping every night? Yeah, sure. I mean, that's just part of the discomfort of going through a big training block. But at the end of the day, he wasn't injured. He handled it just fine. And hopefully that'll reap a lot of adaptation that he can kind of use towards Tour de Jante, because he doesn't have he doesn't have that type of mountainous terrain available. So we just had to get it all in one shot. But I guess my point with that is when you set up training camps and you look at your year from a training perspective, and particularly if you don't have a lot of the terrain access or you're limited on time and you're setting up these camps, don't be afraid to just go all in and take advantage of the camp. The worst thing is you slow down. And that's not the worst thing in the world, because you're still probably running and hiking faster than you will do during the race anyway, even in these camp types of situations. So that's the learning lesson that I'm going to take forward is that we can take advantage of these camp situations much more so than we think we can. And when you look at it on paper, it's always scary to me. That's what I can't get over as a coach, Because when I look at it on paper, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to kill this person. And you guys know me, I'm not a volume monger or anything like that. But when I look at the proposition of doing some of these on paper, I'm like, this is a big, huge increase. And every single time they're able to handle it. I can't think of more than 2 or 3 out of my whole coaching career where the camp has been even slightly too much. So they've always been able to handle it. So that's what I'm going to take forward to next year, is I'm going to just keep like pushing the envelope on that, because it's just such a huge advantage.
I think another takeaway from that is for the athletes themselves, right? Like if I think about athletes that I've had done, and the ones I'm speaking about now, they're not athletes that have gone to a camp. It's like we've planned a 3-4 day training block that we're calling, their camp. And in most of the cases, they've gone somewhere else. So an athlete from Austin that went out to Montana, an athlete from New York City that went out to trained around Logan, Utah, things like that. But what they've noticed is like getting away from their everyday environment, where they're not worrying about like kids, family, job, how much all that stuff, takes energy from them, because they realize like, wow, when I just have to worry about running and feeding myself and sleeping, I can do amazing things and I can feel really awesome. Right. And it's a good learning lesson, I think, for us as coaches, how much more they can handle without those stresses. But I think for the athletes themselves to realize why it's hard to do this in their regular life, because they've got so much other stuff that takes time and energy.
What's funny that I just realized is that, particularly with our Colorado Springs camp, I know people who have come to it with the intention of working every day. So like, oh, I'm connected everywhere. I can work remotely, especially now, right? We can like work remotely and things like that. And they think in advance. They're like, okay, the runs end at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and then I'll have, I can work during dinner and blah, blah, blah. Normally what happens is they're just so tired that they just say, screw it. Like, I'm just taking, our coaches do this too at camp. They think that they're going to be able to build schedules and things like that.
Yeah,
normally that gets either cut in half or completely wiped off the table as well. But my point is that I think it's also not only the great training lesson that we get and the great training bumps that we get from camp, but it's also a little bit of a learning lesson that, you can put some of those aside. I'm not saying you can put everything aside. And I know people have, really highly stressful jobs and mission critical things that they have to do every day. But a lot of those things, if you really want to maximize your performance, you'll find a way to put it aside for a few days and focus on training. Those things are going to be there when you come out of the tunnel on the other side, and they're not going to be any different than they were 2 or 3 days ago. And a lot of our athletes learn that during the camps itself, that it's okay to kick the can down the road on something that they thought was material before the camp, that they find that is not material after they neglected it for a few days, and were able to kind of like catch back up on it. But the total amount of work takes care of that for them, because they ended up just being so tired out of the day. We have this shirt that's like eat, sleep, run, repeat. It is that, right? Eat, sleep, run, rest, eat again, and then repeat. I don't know if we wanted to make it that accurate, but when you do that, a lot of things that you thought were important end up not being important, and you end up surprising yourself in terms of the total amount of work you can do.
Yeah, especially if you're prioritizing your sleep and your rest.
Yeah. And the literature teases this out as well. One of the reasons I'm a big advocate for these training camps is that you get more adaptation per unit of time. And that's because the stress is concentrated into a smaller area. In addition to that, you obviously get more stress because there's more total time. But because you're making it into, in between 2 or 4 days seems to be the sweet spot. And like I said, the literature will back this up again. There's a concentration effect of that workload of where it actually ends up in a superior adaptation, as opposed to if you just took that 12-hour run that you did on one day and peanut butter spread it out through the entirety of the week on 2-hour runs for 6 days or something like that. And so it's just such a big advantage from all of these different areas. not only the physical part of it, but also you get to practice parts of your nutrition that you normally wouldn't get to because of the duration of the runs. There's a lot of confidence that's derived from it. Everybody asks what my longest long run is going to be, and that's normally a confidence oriented question, right? They want some marker of confidence, and these camps can kind of serve that the ends to that mean a little bit, because you've done a big run and a big run and a big run kind of all back to back. So they're multifaceted in terms of what you actually reap from these camps at the end of the day.
And I think these camps, I think we talk about them and for 100 milers, 200 milers. If it's the athlete's first 50K, 50 miler, you can still apply these same concepts of 3-day concentrated load. Okay, yeah, it's not the same amount of volume that a 100-mile camp would be, but if it's your first 50K, that's going to be a lot more training that you can concentrate in those 3 days, and like really focusing on your training. Just because it's not that magical triple digit number of 100, 200 miles or whatever, you can still plan your own big training camp for a 50 miler that's your first 50 miler. When you really care about and you want a PR, you can still take that same concept and apply it to your training.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ryne, is a lot of people will kind of pigeonhole these things into just the really high volume stuff because of the time proposition. But if you're doing 50K, 50 mile or something on, I would even say a marathon, having these concentrated training camps can still be just as effective. If anything, you get to feel like a pro for a few days. Yeah. Which is kind of cool. I mean, we see that at the training camps, at the group training camps that we did here, is they just feel like that they're getting they're getting all this special treatment because they've got coaches around and the meals are catered for them and there's professional guidance and they can kind of ping things off of the experts. And sometimes we bring in, technology and what's coming up next in nutrition and all that stuff to the table as well. But the point that you don't have to I'm giving this example of 10 to 12 hours a day. It doesn't have to be that big, but I think this at least threefold your normal training volume. I think that can almost be a starting point. And that, once again, even when I say it, it sounds super scary. Like it would be something in our coaching continuing eds. If we just saw that on somebody's calendar, we'd be like, whoa, what's going on there? Like, whoa, hold on. Let's make sure that you're not going to destroy them just for those 3 days. I mean, that's the way that we would look at it in that type of context. But in these training camp contexts, it's just, that's almost not enough. Like every year, it just that ratio just gets bigger and bigger for me. I don't know what the limit of it is.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned about the different race distances, Ryne, for training camps. I have an athlete who's doing this race in Utah, and he lives in New York City, and he just did a 3-day training camp around Logan. I had some really awesome help from coaches Nicole and Darcy to plan it out. When I told them what race he's preparing for, Darcy was amazing. She made me a really awesome route that was part of the course, so he could do some course recce, because it's not a very well-known race and it's not the easiest to navigate. And it was great because he went out there, he had the map on his watch, and at one point he lost GPS signal and had to figure things out, like how to get himself safely around. So it was, invaluable in terms of not just the volume of training, but building confidence being in that kind of terrain, having him as well prepared as we could have had him, but still realizing that, things can still go wrong, but I'm confident that I have the tools to figure my way out. And I think from a coaching perspective, that's something we definitely have, within our group, that we have so many coaches in so many locations that can provide some guidance and help to really hone things in for athletes.
Well, and I think athletes are taking advantage of these more and more because the technology is so much more accessible, and you can see other people's routes via the heat maps and things like that on Strava. It just makes it that much more tangible, because let's face it, going to a new area, and people are typically coming to the mountains. Let's just face it. That's the prototype. People are coming from the flats to the mountains. Part of the hesitation is I don't know how long this loop is going to take me, right? Or I don't even know how long it is sometimes. And the accessibility of being able to look at a route through the lens of somebody else's training, or having somebody else who has done it that, like you were just mentioning with one of our coaches, being able to plan that out, put it on your phone. You never have cell phone service, but you've always had that track. You know that, so-and-so did it in 6 hours, 2 years ago, and you ran with that person. So you kind of know how fit they are. Like that whole sphere of knowledge and technology can facilitate people doing these on their own to a much greater degree than it was 5 or 7 years ago, when it was actually kind of hard to like figure that for a lot of reasonable people, including myself. It was actually hard to kind of like figure that out in terms of how big is this day actually going to be, because it's in a new environment.
Yeah, it was awesome. Like, thanks to their help and the information we had, and knowing this athlete of how he's likely going to move in this terrain. And I had, time goals for each day. The routes that we chose, he was like bang on for each of them.
Wow. That's awesome.
So
that's
awesome.
Usually kind of the hardest part when you're going into a new environment, is trying to like figure out, this route is going to take me that long. Like even in a race, we talk about this in our coaching group, when we're trying to plan splits for races, which you have a lot of data, it's still super hard.
Still hard.
Yeah, it's still really hard. So you can imagine, like, when you scale that data down to, whatever you're scaling it down to, figuring it. But see, once again, I just kind of come back to, if I'm plus or minus 10% or 20%, they can still handle it. Like, I don't like really view that as a positive or a negative. It just kind of is what it is. The volume just takes care of itself when they get out there. I hope a lot of people are planning training camps after they listen to this. This is probably like the 5th podcast I've done this year on
they really should be. I mean, especially if we come back to, building confidence and things like that. If an athlete does something like this, if after the fact they start having doubts, I find it's a really nice kind of thing I can come back to. Yeah. Yes, but let's come back to what you just did 3 weeks ago and how well that went, despite the fact that you live in Austin or New York or wherever it is. And they're like, okay, right. Because they just seem to forget it, and then they're concerned about missing one workout.
I've brought that up both in those exact situations where, Chantelle, you kind of let off with this like crisis of confidence piece. Talking about my combative strategy is to look at the totality of training. Normally a piece of training that I emphasize is some big training block or training camp. Like, you remember when you did this? Okay, that's like 30 hours of work, and you're worried about this 1 hour of work. It's like, come on, let's like think about this rationally. But I've also used it in races, either if I pace an athlete, which is kind of rare, or if I'm just there as support, which is kind of like more common, to get him out of the chair, or, bring him out of a low spot, or even just kind of perpetuate having a good day. Like, hey, you've been through all this before. You did 3 10-hour runs, and now you're at hour 20. Like, what this feels like. So just keep doing whatever you're doing that has got you this far. Like, those types of things, you're absolutely correct, especially if the athlete can remember it, can serve as big confidence points leading up to and actually during the race. And the during the race one can actually be fueled if they've done their camp on the race course. Yeah. Which is tricky. True. I know it's like a totally idealistic situation, but still, I mean, it's super powerful if you can do it.
Or if they've tried to kind of replicate the type of terrain or the type of, or even if it's like, I think of one of my athletes who's doing a race in Oregon. He was going to do a training camp in Montana because he's got family there and a place to have as an HQ. We couldn't find anything similar. It was going to be harder. Well, great. You've done something even harder than what you're going to have to do for your race.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're going to be fine.
Yeah. You have a 2,000 foot descent in the race, and now you've done a 3,000 foot descent in training. Piece of cake. Yeah.
It's going to be easy, easier.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, this was awesome, you guys. I appreciate the perspective that you have as coaches. Once again, we can always bring to the table more experience collectively than we can individually. And I hope the listeners really take to heart for next year, 2023, when this podcast comes out, as they start to plan some of these lessons that we've kind of learned throughout the year. And I hope that our coaches actually listen to this as well, because I'll come back to it and be like, oh yeah, I remember when we talked about that. Here's how I'm going to plan so that that's not as big of an issue next year. Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks all. See you.
Thank you.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Chantelle and Ryne for coming on the podcast today and enlightening us with the things that they have learned this year and what they are going to change in order so that their athletes can be more prepared for future years. I also hope that everybody in the audience can appreciate the fact that this is a little bit of a window into our coaching, education, and mentorship process. And it is a big part of what makes our coaches help our athletes to be more successful. They are able to get far more experience in education than the years of coaching that they have underneath their belts and the number of athletes that they work with, because they have this collective group of coaches around them that can help make them better coaches each and every single day. And that in turn, and most importantly, helps our athletes out the most. Appreciate the heck out of each and every one of the listeners. If part of this podcast resonates with you, or you think it would resonate with your training partners, go ahead, share this podcast with your friends, your family, your running compadres. I would appreciate it very much. It is part of what keeps this podcast sponsorship and ad free, and is one of the promises that I made to the audience from the onset of this podcast is I'm always going to give it to you straight. And the way that I can do that is to not take any sponsorship or advertising dollars. And the way that I am able to do that is just simply because you guys continue to share this amongst your group of friends and family and training partners. So thank you guys for doing that. That is it for today, folks. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.